but the immersive experience can certainly help people. The closest example I have is I do a lot of work helping people feel more comfortable and confident speaking. In other words, combating anxiety around communication, which many of us or most of us have. And there are amazing virtual reality applications that can help people desensitize themselves by putting them in that environment virtually to practice and hone those skills so they can feel more confident. So I've seen absolute benefit from that.
Welcome everyone to today's discussion on the wild and wacky world of virtual social interactions, which is advancing to another level now with AR and VR becoming. It's hard to believe that just a few years ago, the concept of having entire relationships and social circles existing solely online was completely absurd. But now we are here in the age of internet where we can virtually connect with people from all corners of the globe at the click of a button. Yes, but as convenient as that is, it's important to also consider the impact of that on real world communications. So, today we are going to deep dive into the fascinating discussion with our guest speaker for today, Matt O'Brien. Matt O'Brien is a lecturer of strategic communication at Stanford Graduate School of Business and the host of the Top Careers podcast, Think Fast, Think Smart, a show with research-backed techniques for becoming a more confident communicator. So we are actually getting the first-hand views on the topic from the best in the field. Let's get started. So welcome, Matt, to the podcast. We are thrilled and excited to have you here. How are you feeling?
I'm doing great, and I'm excited to be here as well. Thanks for having me.
Great. So I think we'll just dive right into the conversation today. And to start with, I would start with a very straightforward question. So how have the shifts in social norms and communication styles brought about by virtual social interactions and affected, let's say, the way we construct our identities around?
Wow. Well, that's quite the question to start with. Clearly, being virtual has changed the way that we communicate. In some ways, for very good, and for other ways, for more challenging. So, one of the benefits of being virtual or having to have gone through that experience is one, it's brought about equity in a way that we haven't experienced it before. So, for example, when we were back meeting in offices and people were having meetings together in a room, where you sat mattered. If you were a leader, you would sit at the head of the table. You would be expected to take up more space and time. And yet, virtually in these tools like Zoom, Meet, Teams, all of these, we're just a box, and our box is among the other boxes. And so it brought about a bit of equity where everybody was perceived in some ways similar. So that was helpful. We also had the ability to communicate multimodally simultaneously. So we could chat and follow up. We could provide people with additional information. So somebody who might be a little more hesitant to speak might be able to contribute by putting things in the chat. So there were some benefits that came about that are still here today as we go back into a more hybrid mixed world. Now, certainly some negative aspects. Just the total cognitive demand of communication, being always on, being in front of a camera more frequently, very taxing and very tiring. So both benefits and downsides to what happened virtually, and those are carrying forward. People are having to adjust and adapt to how they present themselves now, again in person, and then also virtually. So absolutely. And then in terms of how we represent ourselves, the other part of your question I heard is our persona and how we actually manage how people see us. The pandemic partnered with social media has really made all of us curators of our own image and curators of how people see us in a way that we have never had to do before. And for some people, that's fun and exciting, and for other people, it can be quite draining, challenging, and psychologically what's the right word? I don't want to say damaging, but hurtful. So I think we have to adjust and adapt. And in the students that I teach as a professor of MBA students, I certainly see students struggling with who they want to be in person and online and social media. And it becomes much more an issue of reputation and how you manage that, for sure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so, because you mentioned that, how it's a dilemma to say, how you would maintain your identity on the online and how you're, let's say, in person. So my next question would be, how do you think virtual interactions have changed the way we form and maintain our social support groups, and maybe how we have those real world communications and conversations with our friends and family?
Well, I think one of the challenges that came from being virtual all the time was that things became much more transactional.
Mm.
And we had our lists, we had to get through our lists, we had our agendas. If we wanted to have a casual or perhaps a more emotionally deep conversation, we still had to schedule it, and it felt like a meeting, even though it wasn't intended to be. So the feelings that we had were changed significantly, and I still think the way that we can connect, the way that we can get social support are still the same. It's through taking time, asking questions, sharing vulnerabilities. Those are still true. It just feels different when we're not physically in the same space, and we're doing it through the same tools that we do our meetings and other interactions. So I don't think there's anything magical about how you connect virtually. I think you just have to take the time and remind yourself that it's something that you need to do. Warmth, immediacy, all of those can be done remotely. It's
Yeah.
just a little bit more challenging.
True, true. And so you also mentioned earlier that, how when we would go to the offices, the boss or the person who's higher in the hierarchy, they would sit in a separate, let's say, level, or in a separate corner to say, and the associates or the people who are under or maybe working under that person would be in a different level. So, to what extent do you think that, how we have started interacting socially and like in a virtual form, we have started taking these interactions, have disrupted that traditional power dynamics and, facilitated the creation of new ones, particularly, let's say, regarding the issue of representation and inclusivity?
Yeah, so I think it has been disrupted. I think people are now that we're coming back into the office or in hybrid, people are like, how does this work, right? I think one
Yeah.
of the big things that happened during the pandemic and becoming virtual is the level of formality in many ways was decreased, right? We were in people's homes, literally seeing people in their non-professional environments. And so some of the more expected or traditional ways of interacting are no longer expected, and many of us are still trying to figure out what that's like. I personally think it's great because we are more authentic, right? We are who we are. We don't have to put
Yeah.
on this is me in my professional world. But there is a bit of confusion in trying to figure this out. But I think the companies that do best at this are the companies that, one, acknowledge that, and two, are fluid and allow for new norms to evolve and recognize that things are changing and be adaptive to that. So I absolutely think things are in flux, and what the new normal will look like will be very interesting. But it is something that we all have to work at and acknowledge. Just trying to go back to the way it used to be
Yeah.
is going to be very challenging.
True. So, how do you suggest the companies to transition? Let's say, because there are companies who are actually facing a challenge while they're transitioning. So, what would be your suggestion on that note?
So first and foremost, talk about it. Say, we need to think about how we want to interact. And one of my colleagues at the business school, Jonathan Lavav, has a great way of looking at this. And essentially, rather than looking at the behaviors, look at the purpose of the behaviors. So
Interesting.
so when we greet people, especially typically here in North America, when we greet people, we shake hands. Other places greet in different ways, but the purpose of the shaking hands is to connect, is to initiate. So if you look rather than at the behavior, because in a hybrid meeting, I can shake your hand if we're in the room, but if you're virtual, how do I connect? So we might come up with a new norm for connecting when we first come together. That's not a handshake, that's not a thumbs up. We come up with some way of doing it. So I think the way companies do this is to take a step back and say, what was the purpose of a lot of our old ways of doing things, and how can we, in this hybrid or new way of interacting, accomplish those tasks in a way that's comfortable, in some ways more equitable, uh, for everybody. So it's the companies that look at it that way, I think, that are going to be more successful and have less bumpy road in trying to accomplish these goals.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So I remember when we all were into COVID, we all thought, I think there were discussions that, this is always going to be online. It's never going to, come out of this mode. And so a lot of advancements happened in the technology also. Like, I think a lot of platforms, including, let's say, Zoom, where we are hosting this, they adapted, they scaled basis, the demand that came in. And also there was an advancement of AR, VR, like how do we
Yeah.
interact more immersively when we are in the virtual environment? How do we take it more closer to the, real world interactions that we had? But now we are back offline. We are all in the office now again. So I wanted to understand that with these recent advancements in technology, particularly in the realm of AR and VR, how do you envision virtual social interactions evolving in the future? And like, let's say, like, do you think that the increasing use of AR, VR, which is advanced with this COVID happening in virtual communication, will enhance the feeling of presence and immersion in online interactions? Or do you think it will detract people from the authenticity of having those conversations?
I do think that AI, VR, all of that, in many ways, has the opportunity to connect us and bring us closer together, and will open up modalities of communication that we've never experienced before. At the same time, we have to be very cognizant that these put extra demands on us, right? So I might have to be paying attention to many more things than I used to if I'm interacting with you in a VR reality. And so we want to make sure that whatever we create, we do so in a way that can empower us with new connecting techniques without disadvantaging us by just taking more of our cognitive bandwidth. And there's some very exciting things coming out.
Yeah.
I know I have a colleague and friend who's working on haptic technology, so we don't have to look somewhere else to read the feedback that you're getting. We actually could be wearing wristbands and other things that'll vibrate and give us information that's useful in the moment while allowing me to still stay connected. So I do think technology will help us address these issues and give us advantages, but there's going to be this awkward phase where we're going to get the ability to do a lot of things that are going to also be very taxing for us. So I'm very hopeful, and I'm really curious to see how this stuff will all play out.
True. And because you already are teaching, a MBA batch and session, so how do you think, let's say, we were to take education with this virtual, reality and immersion, do you think that would be a good idea, or do you think that would be as effective as, let's say, the online sessions are?
So I do think it has the opportunity to be as effective, if not more effective, for sure. So we have seen for years the notion of simulation for learning and desensitization of people who might have anxiety or concerns over things. So I absolutely do think that there's a place for it. Now, does it replace completely the way that we do in person or even virtual? I don't know. I think it is something that partners with. But the immersive experience can certainly help people. The closest example I have is I do a lot of work helping people feel more comfortable and confident speaking. In other words, combating anxiety around communication, which many of us, or most of us, have.
Yeah, yeah.
And there are amazing virtual reality applications that can help people desensitize themselves by putting them in that environment virtually to practice and hone those skills so they can feel more confident. So I've seen absolute benefit from that. Would it be beneficial to have everything that way? I'm not sure about that.
Got it. And so, because since we all started, I think a lot of it was facilitated because of COVID. But we all started having our professional networks and connections offline, right? And then in
Mhm.
that way, how do you suggest people to navigate now the career prospects which have opened up with the online and offline combination, and how do they kind of envision their success while maintaining the balance between the online app and the offline?
You ask questions that are very philosophical and challenging in nature. So, I think it comes down to, first and foremost, for each individual to define what their goals are and what success looks like relative to those goals. So if it's career-based, what are my goals for my career? How can the virtual components of that be focused on? How can the in-person, how can the networks that support that? So I don't think there's one answer for everybody. I think the question actually is what's really important, to say, I now have more tools to influence my career, to support me both personally and professionally. How much do I want to invest in each of these? How do I want to spend my time and leverage across these? That I think becomes more of the way we approach it and our mindset, and then how do we actually personalize it for each person? So I think the question, just by asking the question, I think you get the answer. Is there one size fits all? No, except to say that I hope everybody makes a conscious choice of where they put their investment and their time to grow their careers.
Right. Honestly, I love that answer, because a lot of people think that there is a step 4 ways that you can achieve something, but it's very relative, and it's very, I think very customizable to say for every person. So thanks for
Absolutely.
that. I think that was a very important answer. But now with that, we've come to a very interesting segment of our podcast, which is a rapid fire round. So are you ready
All
for
right, I'm ready.
Interesting. So I may ask whys of the questions, so that would also come along. Yeah. So the first question is, if you could read only one book for the rest of your life, which book would that be and why?
So I have a particular bent towards Eastern philosophy.
Wow.
And in Zen Buddhism, there are what are called koans, puzzles, mental puzzles, that are meant to break and disrupt traditional ways of thinking, and in so doing, get people closer to enlightenment or truth, in quotes. If I only had one book to read, I would want a book like that poses questions and concerns, so that I could read it many, many times, and each time have different epiphanies and experiences of it. For me personally, the greatest texts, reading them over and over again, that would be hard. But something that challenges me and disrupts the way I think, that's what I would rely on. So a book of Zen koans is what I would want to have.
I love that. That was very interesting. So the second question is, if you could only use one word, and I know because you're so much into communication, how hard that is going to be, but if you were to use only one word for the rest of your career, what would that word be and why?
So I have two answers. So I'm going to give you two one-word answers and let you pick. Because I believe so much in the power of collaboration and the power of connection, I would use the word yes. Yes gets you to so many places. In the world of improv, yes and is so powerful. But I knew you wouldn't let me get away with yes and, so I'm going to stick with yes. And then the fundamental mistake people make in their communication is they make it all about them. So the other word I would focus on is you. So it's not about me, it's about you. It's about the audience, it's about others. So if I had to pick a word, both of them would start with the letter Y, yes or you, and I'll let you decide which is best.
I think I'll take both.
There you go.
Yes. So the last question is, if you could only use one type of social media, and because we're all very virtual and this whole conversation was about virtual social interactions, what would be that one social media platform that you would use for the rest of your life and why?
So I assume you're not talking about email and texting. So you're
Oh,
talking about one of the big media companies. Yeah. So I live mostly on LinkedIn. I have found for the work that I do, LinkedIn is a good place to learn and a good place to connect. So if you only gave me one, that's where I would be, although I believe all of the others are very important, and I try to have a presence on all of them. But I live mostly on LinkedIn.
nice. I think Microsoft is going to be happy today if at all they hear to the podcast.
Yes. Although
Nice.
we're doing Zoom, not Teams, so we'll see how happy they are.
Yes, that makes sense. That makes sense. So, with that, Matt, we've come to the end of the podcast, but I'm not letting you go right now. There's one last question. So, because you come from the depth of communications and you help people with, how do they gain confidence while they're communicating? What would be your one best advice to say, to all those people who are looking to excel in that domain?
These questions that give me a limit of one thing make my life so difficult. So the one thing I would say I alluded to earlier when you asked me for my one word, it's not about you, it's about them. If you can make your communication about your audience through listening to their needs, to asking questions, to demonstrating compassion and paraphrasing, you will have a much more connected, relevant, salient interaction. So if you force me to say one and only one thing, it's about your audience. It's not about you, is what I would say. Now, I could add a lot of other things, but that would be the number one thing.
Nice. That was a great answer. That was great. And thank you so much. I think this podcast has been extremely insightful and informative. And especially since we all are, I think, still transitioning in a lot of ways from the online to offline. I think this is going to like add real value to the lives of people. And it was a pleasure having you. I personally enjoyed every minute of this conversation. I'm sure that the audience and the people who are going to listen to it are also going to enjoy it too. So thank you for taking the time and thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And I too enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.